Good afternoon. I wanted to thank the judges and the Nation Institute, Fertile Foundation, and the Stuart Mott Foundation for this, and I'm thrilled to be here to offer the Ridenhour Book Prize to Jill Leovy. The book has been nominated for and won other awards since it's come out, but I think this one's particularly appropriate and gratifying to present to Jill because it honors her work for truth-telling in the service of creating a more just society. I think Jill's work and the story she tells in Ghetto Side are parallel case studies of how those two concepts, relentless truth-telling and justice, work together. The laser-like focus of her work has always been the former, telling the truth wherever it might lead her. And Ghetto Side is a brilliant demonstration that searching for the truth and telling it with artistry and integrity is a fruitful path on the difficult journey to a more just society. I was Jill Leovy's editor for Ghetto Side. I acquired it 7 or so years ago and worked with her up to and even after its publication last year. At the time I acquired the project, the book was called The Homicide Report, a reference to the blog of the same name that Jill created at the LA Times. Jill was a reporter at the Times then, as she is now, and created the blog in response, I'm sorry, someone calling me, to a nagging question. Who exactly are the hundreds of people being killed in Los Angeles every year, the ones whose stories never make the front page? In her work on the blog, she would report on, as best she could, every one of over 700 murders in Los Angeles that year, the murders that the rest of the city was resolutely trying not to see. Her reporting took her again and again to the same neighborhoods, the same streets, sometimes the same blocks. It became clear that this huge number of homicides every year in Los Angeles was concentrated in only a small handful of communities distorted by the frequency of violent death, islands within the city that existed under the low-hanging cloud of tragedy, enclaves defined in large part by a long and ongoing war that the rest of the city felt free to ignore, even as the bloody war was unfolding within its borders. Jill insisted on seeing it and showing it to the rest of us. The blog became something of a sensation at the time and the model for homicide reports that were spread across the country. Jill had made visible a subterranean calamity that was claiming thousands of our country's young people every year, year after year, which was a heroic act of journalistic innovation, but she didn't stop there. Her next question was, why are the murders all concentrated in the city's black neighborhoods, particularly in South Los Angeles? This was a tricky question to even ask for 2 reasons. First, because for many people, whether they admit it or not, there is no question there. They implicitly take for granted that black people die of homicide in disproportionate numbers because they always have, for reasons that we're too polite to pursue. The other difficulty of the question is that connecting race and crime has often been the tool of overt racist, and opens any pursuit of the question to the charge of aiding and abetting certain conclusions about the inherent violence of black people. So it's a topic of exceeding sensitivity, which has made some writers shy away from it. But Jill saw people dying. She spent time with mourning families every day, multiple times a day. For that year, she wrote her blog. She reported on hundreds of people murdered in a small set of area codes and a city's indifference to those deaths, and in that saw 2 other things, a great injustice and a great mystery. And like the great journalist she is, she saw in those 2 things a great story. But how to tell it? This is where things got complicated. No matter how interesting the questions she had were, she had to find the right narrative as her vehicle for exploring them. She embedded herself with a group of homicide detectives in South LA, got to know the detectives and get a deep feel for their work. She researched homicide statistics and case studies from throughout history, through mythology, all over the world. She read the literature, talked to the criminologist. She slowly started to connect broad, abstract theories about how law and society built each other with the scenes of tragedy and grief that she encountered every day. But the story itself didn't come alive until she met 2 unusually effective and compelling detectives in Los Angeles, one who had lost a child to a murder, and the other who was charged with investigating it. I'll let her tell you more about this if she chooses, or better yet, read the book, but once she hit on that story, all of her questions started to converge into answers. I think the reason she related to one of the detectives, John Skaggs in particular, was that they were, in their way, professional doppelgangers. I'm not sure how Jill will feel about this, but John Skaggs was a detective who, if you pressed him, might agree that he's interested in truth-telling in the pursuit of a more just society, but would then roll his eyes and rush to the nearest piece of tangible work at hand. He saw justice in very plain terms. If someone is murdered, you find the murderer and you lock him up. You find the murderer by asking the right questions over and over again, by knocking on as many doors as you need to, by being respectful and listening, really listening to the anxieties and the fears and the stories of the survivors and witnesses. To Skaggs, the truest compassion came in the form of action. It was doing the work with as much creativity, imagination, sweat, fearlessness, and integrity as you can bring to it. Anything else was useless noise, no matter how good the intentions were. I would say the same is true for Jill as a reporter. I think she'd agree that she sees her role as truth-telling in the pursuit of a more just society, but she is someone who believes, perhaps more than any writer I've ever worked with, that telling the truth, digging down as deeply as possible into what can be known, through relentless reporting and research, is the key to that justice. Jill's gift is seeing, really seeing those hidden murders, of course, but also seeing the nuanced humanity of the characters she renders, whether cops, killers, or grieving grandmothers. She sees the complexities of the argument she's making and doesn't flinch, and she sees even things that are hard to see, the absences created by hundreds of young black men murdered year after year who are lost to us all. She has complete faith in the truth. She didn't want her book to have one extra word. Through the process of revision, she removed every possible bit of ornamental or overworked language. The book instead is a rivetingly muscular read, full of austere poetry, the austere poetry of plain truth, deeply reported. It's a beautiful, moving act of narrative journalism. One of the questions I have as an editor and now publisher of a new imprint is how should books respond to issues of injustice and inequality? Jill has taught me a great deal about that question, in part because we've never once talked about it in any kind of explicit or intentional way. Her way is, again, similar to the approach of the detectives she writes about in Ghetto Side. How do you address injustice? First of all, see as much as you can. Gather as much evidence as you can, and don't flinch or turn away. From the homicide report to this book, Jill has made an art of empathetic seeing. Second, keep asking questions. Many of the injustices we see in our country, especially on the matter of race, are old injustices, hundreds of years old, so old, in fact, we sometimes stop asking ourselves the question of why. But once we start asking, we find answers that are both more complex and simpler than we imagined. More complex because they require some digging and imagination and rigor to arrive at them, but simpler because the answers turn out not to be magic, but usually embedded in policies that can be changed. Third is to find a way to connect to others. Some of the writers I work with come from more literary backgrounds. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a great reporter, but started as a poet. Brian Stevenson is a lawyer, but his written work bears the signs of his brilliant skills as an orator. But Jill takes her own particular skill as a reporter and newspaper journalist and uses it to create narrative art from deep reporting. There's powerful storytelling in Ghetto Side, deep humanity, and the language feels like an etched diamond. It's a book that makes you think, sometimes makes you mad, and more than once will make you cry. It connects and it changes every person who reads it. It's nice to be able to talk at length about this book in Jill's presence, or her virtual presence. In our many, many conversations and email exchanges over the years, I felt her silent judgment every time I slipped into hyperbolic praise and quickly silenced myself and returned to whatever matter was at hand. But now she has to take it all the praise I've stifled over the years, along with this, the 2016 Ridenhour Book Prize. Congratulations, Jill.